right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going on a journey, a deep dive into the mind of a really interesting figure in English philosophy, Ralph Cudworth. Born in 1618, he lived through a period of, massive historical and intellectual upheaval. And what's interesting is, instead of just jumping into all the new ideas floating around, he actually went back and found originality by looking to the past.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You'll often hear Cudworth lumped in with this group called the Cambridge Platonists. And while that label kind of gives you a general idea of his intellectual circle, it's not something he would have called himself.
Yeah.
And, he's frequently labeled as a rationalist, but I think the deeper we go into his actual writings, you'll see that it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, I think that's often the case with these labels. They're useful, but you can't get too attached to them, right? They can oversimplify things.
Absolutely. It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. So to navigate this iceberg, to explore the depths of Cudworth's thought, we have this incredible resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Ralph Cudworth. It's comprehensive, well-researched, and a perfect guide for our deep dive.
Definitely. And what we really want to do today is get to the heart of Cudworth's most significant philosophical contributions.
Yeah.
The ideas that still resonate with us, centuries later. Like, how do we know what we know? What is reality even made of? And where do we humans fit into this grand scheme of things?
Those big timeless questions that never go away.
Exactly. Now, I will say, fully grasping Cudworth's system can be a bit challenging. It's almost like we're trying to rebuild an ancient, intricate clock, but some of the parts are missing.
Yeah.
You see, he left behind tons of unpublished manuscripts, and even his published works, they feel, I don't know, somehow unfinished.
So we're piecing together a puzzle.
Yeah, in a way, that's what makes this journey so fascinating, right? We're trying to reconstruct a brilliant mind at work.
I like that. So before we dive into those intricacies, let's get some context. Who was Ralph Cudworth? And what kind of intellectual world shaped his thinking?
Well, Cudworth had a really impressive, surprisingly stable academic career, all at Cambridge University. He started as a fellow, then moved up to Master of Clare College, became the Regius Professor of Hebrew, and eventually Master of Christ's College. What's really remarkable, though, is he held on to these prominent positions throughout the English Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy.
That's wild. I mean, that was a period of intense political upheaval and religious change. To stay afloat through all that, he must have been an incredible diplomat or had some serious focus on his scholarly work.
I think it was a combination of both, to be honest. He was obviously brilliant and dedicated to his studies, but also politically savvy enough to navigate those turbulent waters.
And you mentioned earlier that he had a daughter, right?
Yes. Damaris. She later became Lady Masham and was a brilliant mind in her own right. She was close friends with, and this is fascinating, John Locke. So you see a direct connection there to another giant of 17th century philosophy.
Wow, that's a pretty impressive family tree. So let's talk about the ideas he actually put into writing. His major work was The True Intellectual System of the Universe, or TCU for short. What's the deal with that book?
Okay, so TCU, published in 1678, was his one big philosophical work published while he was alive. But he also left behind two other very important books that were published after his death. A treatise concerning eternal and immutable morality, Team for Us, published in 1731, and a Free Will, or FW, published much later in 1838. And then there are all those unpublished manuscripts, mostly focused on the idea of liberty and necessity, which probably circulated privately among intellectuals back then.
Sounds like TC was just one part of a much larger, grander project.
You got it. He actually planned the true intellectual system of the universe as this huge three-part work. The first part, which is what we have as TCU, was titled Against Atheism. The second part was going to be Natural Justice and Morality Founded in the Deity, and the third, Liberty from Necessity and a Distributive Justice of Rewards and Punishments.
So ambitious, right?
Wow, what a shame the whole thing never saw the light of day. But even that title, The True Intellectual System, it's intriguing. What did he mean by intellectual in this context? It seems loaded with meaning.
Yeah, it's a key word for Cudworth. He used intellectual to distinguish his system from the purely physical or astronomical explanations of the universe that were becoming popular in his time. More importantly, it signals his connection to Plato. Plato's concept of eternal, unchanging forms or ideas, those fundamental blueprints for everything that exists. So for Cudworth, the intellectual system is that realm of intelligible reality, the metaphysical framework underpinning everything we experience. I'd say he was probably drawing heavily on Plato's Timaeus. So he's basically saying the world isn't just a bunch of random stuff bumping around.
Not at all. For Cudworth, nature is the creation of divine intellect. His big goal was to create a philosophical system that was both logically rigorous and compatible with religious truth.
So, bridging faith and reason, but with a very Platonist understanding of reality. How did he see himself in relation to other philosophers? I mean, both those who came before him and his contemporaries.
Cudworth was a huge fan of this Renaissance idea of the Philosophia Perennis, the perennial philosophy. The idea that there are these timeless philosophical truths that thinkers throughout history have been trying to discover. And, like a good humanist, he had a massive knowledge of ancient philosophy. Plato, Plotinus, the Stoics, those were his touchstones. And by drawing on them, he was doing what humanists did, grounding his ideas in the authority of the past.
It wasn't just about repeating the ancients, though, right?
Nope. He was actively engaging with their ideas in the context of his own time. He saw Greek philosophy as a source of pre-scholastic ideas and, really interestingly, as a vocabulary for expressing new concepts. He was one of the first big philosophers to write primarily in English, and he actually coined a lot of the philosophical terms we still use today. Cartesianism, self-determination, even consciousness, those are all from Cudworth, and all while engaging with his contemporaries like Descartes.
Right. You mentioned Descartes earlier. He was obviously a big deal for Cudworth.
Oh, absolutely. He called Descartes an acute philosopher, and you can see Descartes' influence all over Cudworth's work. He loved Descartes' ambition to create a system that brought together physics and metaphysics based on material and immaterial substances. He agreed with Descartes on the importance of clear and distinct perception, and he adopted Descartes' understanding of sense perception. Like sensation is this passive reception of impressions that can lead to, unclear understanding.
So a lot of common ground there.
Tons. They even agreed on consciousness, a perfect God, the idea of body is extension. But there were also some big points of disagreement.
Yeah, what were those? Where did they clash?
Well, for one thing, Cudworth argued that purely mechanical explanations of cause and effect in the natural world, things bumping into each other, couldn't fully explain the order and complexity we see. He also wasn't happy with Descartes dismissing final causes. That's the idea that things have purposes or ends. He found Descartes' proof of God, which was based on the idea of God, to be a bit circular. And he was worried that Descartes' focus on God's will, above all else, could lead to skepticism.
I see, so they had their differences.
Oh, yeah. And one big one was about animals. Cudworth totally rejected Descartes' view of animals as just automata. He argued that there was more to immaterial substance than just conscious thought.
That's an interesting distinction. Now, what about Hobbes? I know Cudworth had some strong opinions about him.
That's an understatement. Cudworth's critique of Hobbes is one of the most thorough and detailed from that time. He saw Hobbes as this dangerous materialist and atheist. He accused Hobbes of basically making human nature seem evil, reducing morality to mere social rules, and he argued that Hobbes' theory of natural law was just artificial justice, with no real basis in natural goodness.
So not a fan of Hobbes, then?
Not at all.
No.
A core issue was Hobbes's mechanistic account of mental processes. Cudworth argued that if our minds were just material particles in motion, we could never direct our thoughts or focus our attention intentionally. The fact that we experience ourselves as having this intentional capacity pointed, for him, to the existence of non-material powers that Hobbes' system couldn't explain.
He was really defending a very specific view of human nature, wasn't he?
Absolutely. His big book, Tissue, is actually structured like a critique of the history of philosophy. He categorizes thinkers based on how they support or undermine theism. He argued for the naturalness of the idea of God, claiming that even ancient polytheistic religions were like distorted versions of monotheism. He even categorized different types of atheism he found in ancient and modern thinkers, guys like Hobbes and Spinoza, materialism, atomism, halozoism. It was a full-on defense of his worldview.
Fascinating. So let's dig into the core of Cudworth's own system, his metaphysics. Platonism obviously played a huge role. How did that shape his understanding of reality?
Well, remember the intellectual system. A fundamental principle for him was that mind is first in the order of nature. Mind isn't just something that pops up from the physical world. It's the fundamental cause of it. He famously said, "Knowledge is older than all sensible things. Mind senior to the world and the architect thereof." And by mind, he primarily means God's mind, which contains those perfect blueprints of reality, the eternal forms or ideas. This realm of intellect is above the physical world. Think of it like an original and a copy.
So the physical world is like a reflection of the divine mind.
Exactly. And it's not just a static reflection, it's a living stamp or signature of the divine wisdom. He understood all being as this descending hierarchy, starting with spiritual beings like angels and humans, then down through animals and plants, all the way to what he called plastic nature.
Plastic neat. That sounds strange. What do you mean by that?
Okay, this is where things get really interesting. Plastic nature is this super unique and kind of odd element in Cudworth's system. He imagined it as this intermediary force between God and the workings of the natural world. He came up with this idea because he felt that purely mechanical philosophy, the stuff becoming popular in his time, couldn't properly explain movement, change, how the soul and body are connected, even the existence of life or the overall order we see in the universe. He disagreed with Descartes' idea that the soul is just about thinking. He pointed out that the soul is also responsible for all these unconscious life processes.
So plastic nature fills in the gaps, the things that mechanism couldn't explain.
Exactly. Cudworth saw it as God's tool for keeping the universe running smoothly. It's this inherent force that permeates all material things, regulating life and maintaining a coherent, purposeful system that reflects God's wisdom.
So it's like a divine autopilot.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. But here's a twist. He argued that because plastic nature is just a faint copy of the divine mind, it's capable of making mistakes, or what he called bungles.
Wait, mistakes? How can something that's basically God's instrument make errors?
That's the fascinating part. Cudworth says that because it's just a copy, a shadow of the divine mind, it's inherently limited. And importantly, it operates unconsciously. That's a big difference between plastic nature and human minds. With this idea, Cudworth was trying to find a middle ground. Not God directly intervening in every tiny detail of the universe, not pure determinism and not just random chance. He found support for this in Aristotle and especially Plotinus, who had this idea of unconscious living nature and a interconnected cosmos. It's worth noting that the idea of an intermediary force wasn't entirely new. Henry Moore had this concept called the spirit of nature, but Cudworth's plastic nature was different because it wasn't extended in space.
This is a mind-blowing idea. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about knowledge. What was Cudworth's take on epistemology, on how we come to know things?
Cudworth was all about the active mind in gaining knowledge. He argued that the mind isn't just a passive recipient of information, it shapes its own thoughts, he said. He has this great line, "The mind is formative of its own cogitations." And he distinguished between two main types of knowing, sense perception and intellection. Sense perception for him is passive. It's receiving impressions through the body, which results in, kind of confused and unreliable knowledge. Intellection, on the other hand, is active. It's the power of the noetical or intellectual part of the soul, and it's a source of true knowledge.
So real knowledge comes from within the mind, not just from our senses.
That's the gist of it. He saw the human mind as a intellectual microcosm, like a miniature version of the universe, containing all the fundamental ideas and images in a virtual or potential state. He even used the Stoic term prolepsis to describe those innate ideas that the mind has from the start. So for him, knowledge flows from the general to the particular, from the mind to the world, not the other way around.
Interesting. So where do our senses fit in then? They must have some role.
They do. He uses this analogy. Imagine writing on a blank page. The marks on the page are there, but they only make sense to someone who knows how to read. Likewise, sense perceptions are the raw data, but it takes an active mind to make them meaningful. He believed that we can understand the world because our minds and the universe share a fundamental structure. They both bear the imprint of God's wisdom. He called it the ectype. It's like a shared stamp of intellectuality that makes the world comprehensible to us. So knowing something isn't just passively absorbing data, it's an active process of recognition, like when you see a picture of a friend and recognize them instantly. It's about grasping the underlying essence of things.
So we're not just mirrors reflecting the world, we're actively making sense of it. That brings us to another crucial element of his philosophy, free will. What were his thoughts on this very complicated topic?
Cudworth's views on morality are deeply tied to his ideas about free will. He went up against some of the biggest ideas of his time. Theological voluntarism, that idea that morality comes from God's will, and the concept of liberty of indifference, meaning we can choose randomly with no prior inclination. He also took on Hobbes's view of morality as just commands and the scholastic ideas about psychology that were popular back then. He was adamant that morality wasn't just a social construct or something we learn from experience. For him, basic moral principles are like built-in features of the mind, with a reality that goes beyond the physical world.
So where did he think these moral principles came from?
He grounded them in God's own goodness and justice. Like Socrates in Plato's Euthyphro, he argued that actions aren't good just because God wants them, but God wants them because they are inherently good. Things like goodness, justice, righteousness for him, these are permanent, unchanging qualities. He believed we could understand them using reason, because our minds, in a way, share in the divine intellect.
So objective morality, built into the fabric of the universe.
Exactly. But he also knew that just knowing what's good isn't enough to make us act morally. We're fallible, and we have desires that can lead us astray. He thought our basic motivation is to seek good and happiness, but true moral action needs moral autonomy, which comes from free will. And this is where things get really interesting.
Let's hear it. What was his take on free will?
His most in-depth discussion of free will is in his posthumously published Management of Free Will and those unpublished manuscripts on liberty and necessity. He was really concerned with moral responsibility. He argued that we can only be held accountable for our actions if we truly have the freedom to choose them. If everything's predetermined, whether by God or some all-powerful ruler, then we're not truly responsible. For him, being able to choose was essential for morality and for developing a virtuous character. He redefined free will as this power of self-determination. He even used Greek terms for it, like autoexousion, meaning self-mastery, and hegemonikon, which refers to the ruling part of the soul.
He's highlighting the individual's power to choose their own path.
Absolutely. And he had this really interesting idea about the soul. He moved away from the traditional view of the soul as having separate mental faculties and saw it more as this dynamic interplay of active powers like intellect and reason and passive powers like senses and desires. He compared the hegemonikon, that ruling part of the soul, to the charioteer in Plato's Phaedrus. It has to guide and control all these different forces within us.
So we're not just puppets, controlled by our desires or some external force.
Not at all. But it's also not pure absolute freedom either. It's this intricate interplay of reason, emotions, and the power of self-determination.
This is fascinating stuff. It shows how carefully he thought about these issues. Now, one last piece of the puzzle, consciousness. What did Cudworth have to say about this crucial aspect of the human experience?
For Cudworth, consciousness was absolutely central to his ideas about free will and morality. He argued that for our hegemonikon to make choices, it needed to be aware of what's going on in the soul. That's consciousness. He described it as this inner awareness, an inward sense, that allows the soul to perceive its own actions and experiences.
So self-awareness is key for making free choices.
Exactly. And he agreed with Descartes that thinking implies consciousness. They both understood cogitation broadly, encompassing all kinds of mental activity. But unlike Descartes, who thought the soul was always consciously thinking, Cudworth argued that some things, like those operations of plastic nature, could happen unconsciously. He also recognized that our consciousness isn't always crystal clear. He thought there were different levels of awareness, from clear intellectual understanding to fuzzy sensory perceptions, and even states of semi-consciousness, where we're not paying full attention.
So not just on or off, but a spectrum of awareness.
Precisely. And he was influenced by Plotinus here, who used the term synesthesis, meaning consents or co-perception, to describe this inner awareness. Synesthesis is the highest form of consciousness for Cudworth. It's like self-reflection, where the hegemonikon observes everything going on in the soul, directing its rational powers toward our senses and desires. He called it the soul redoubled upon itself, and he thought it was what gave us the ability to deliberate and choose.
So consciousness isn't just about experiencing things, but about being aware of ourselves experiencing them.
Right, and he thought only beings with free will have this kind of consciousness because only they have that hegemonikon, that ability to consciously direct attention. He even called it the watchman of the soul.
Incredible. It's remarkable how all these pieces of his philosophy, free will, consciousness, the nature of the soul fit together so seamlessly. But given that he didn't publish a lot of his work, what kind of impact did he actually have? What was his legacy?
It is tricky to measure his full impact, precisely because so much of his work on epistemology and ethics remained unpublished. We don't know for sure how widely his manuscripts were read, but there are some interesting similarities between his ideas and those of Locke and Shaftesbury, especially about consciousness, power, and moral sentiment. For a long time, people saw Cudworth primarily as a rationalist in ethics, based on his treatise concerning eternal and immutable morality. Even Hume seemed to think of him that way. But thanks to scholars like John Passmore, who did amazing work on his unpublished writings, we have a much more nuanced understanding now. He actually anticipated later developments in moral philosophy, particularly the rise of moral sentimentalism.
So he was ahead of his time in some ways.
Definitely. But he's still often misunderstood, sometimes reduced to just his theological arguments, his defense of free will, or even seen as some kind of mystic. It's the complexity of his thought that makes him so hard to categorize.
It makes sense. He was wrestling with some big, profound ideas.
Absolutely. And while his writing can be dense and challenging, he had some serious fans among philosophers. Locke, Shaftesbury, Leibniz, Reid, Hume, even Newton, Price, Coleridge, and the American Transcendentalists. And even his strange idea of plastic nature sparked debates for centuries. Thinkers like Pierre Bayle and Jean Leclerc argued about it. Diderot included it in his encyclopédie, and the French philosopher Paul Giat was defending it in the 19th century. And even though he wasn't a bestseller in his own time, Tijoux was republished multiple times and translated into Latin, French, and Italian, so people were engaging with his ideas across Europe.
That says a lot about the enduring power of his work. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Ralph Cudworth was a truly fascinating and complex thinker. He bridged the ancient and the modern, constructing a philosophical system that addressed the most fundamental questions of existence. His ideas about plastic nature, free will, self-awareness, these are all incredibly insightful and still relevant today. Even though we only have part of his complete vision, his work offers a rich and rewarding exploration of philosophical ideas that continue to resonate centuries later.
Couldn't agree more. And maybe this journey leaves you, dear listener, with something to ponder. How might Cudworth's idea of an unconscious force guiding nature relate to modern science's fascination with emergent properties and complex systems? And how does this emphasis on self-determination speak to contemporary debates about agency and responsibility in our ever-changing world? We definitely encourage you to explore Cudworth's writings for yourselves and delve deeper into the intellectual world of the 17th century. There are so many hidden gems of insight waiting to be discovered in his brilliant and multifaceted work.